"You have got 30 days, that is generous," he said without even looking at me as he taped the notice to my door. The paper was flat, the edges clean like it had been printed hours ago, not something that could erase 12 years of my life in a place I used to call home. I stood there in the hallway holding a grocery bag in one hand, milk, eggs, bread, nothing special, just another Tuesday, and I nodded. That was all I did. I nodded like it made sense, like people just get 30 days to disappear. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind him that I had never missed a payment, not once, not even when I was working 2 jobs, not even when my car broke down and I had to walk 3 miles in the rain to make my shift. I just nodded because something inside me had already gone quiet. My daughter was inside, sitting at the small kitchen table doing her homework. She looked up when I walked in. Her pencil paused mid-sentence. She did not ask what the paper was. She did not need to. She had seen that look before. Bills, notices, final warnings, the kind that never bring anything good. I placed the groceries on the counter slowly, like if I moved too fast something might break. The fridge hummed the same way it always did. The clock above the sink ticked louder than usual, or maybe I was just hearing everything differently now. 30 days, that was what he gave me, like I was something temporary, like I had not spent over a decade paying down his mortgage one check at a time. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. My car sat in the same spot, faded blue, a dent on the passenger side from 3 winters ago. Nothing had changed outside. Everything looked normal, and that was the part that made it feel unreal. I thought about all the nights I came home late smelling like cardboard and dust from the warehouse, the early mornings driving strangers across town just to cover rent, the times I skipped meals so my daughter would not have to notice. I thought about how I told myself this was just a phase, just until things got better, but things do not get better on their own. They stay exactly where you leave them unless you move. I turned the paper over in my hands again, white, black ink, simple words, no emotion, no hesitation. 30 days, it felt short, but also long enough to decide what kind of man I was going to be. I could find another place, another lease, another landlord, another version of the same story, or I could finally stop pretending this was temporary. I folded the paper once clean down the middle and set it on the table next to my daughter. She glanced at it, then back at me, her eyes searching for something I had not said yet. I gave her a small nod, the same one I gave him earlier, calm, steady, like everything was under control, because in that moment I realized something. No one was coming to fix this. No one was going to give me more time. No one was going to hand me a better life. I had exactly 30 days, and for the first time in a long time that felt like enough. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was scared, but because my mind would not stay still. It kept running, numbers, rent, utilities, gas, groceries, everything I had been balancing for years, like a quiet routine that no one ever noticed. I sat at the kitchen table long after my daughter went to bed, the same table with the scratch on the corner where she dropped her backpack 3 years ago. I opened my phone and looked at my bank account. The number was not surprising. It never was. Just enough to get through the week, just enough to keep things going, but not enough to change anything. I had lived like that for so long it almost felt normal. I opened another app, my credit report. I had avoided it for years, like something uncomfortable you pretend does not exist. The number sat there plain and honest, 587. It did not judge me. It did not need to. I already knew what it meant. Limited options, higher costs, doors that stay closed. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. The light above flickered slightly. It always had. I thought about calling someone, maybe asking for help, maybe seeing if anyone had a spare room, but the thought faded quickly. I had spent too many years trying not to depend on anyone, not after everything that happened before, not after learning how quickly stability can disappear. I got up quietly and walked into my daughter's room. She was asleep, one arm hanging off the bed, her homework still open beside her. I pulled the blanket up over her shoulder and stood there for a moment, longer than usual. She deserved more than this, more than moving again, more than watching me struggle to hold everything together. I walked back to the kitchen and picked up the notice again. 30 days. It felt different now, not like a threat, not like an ending, more like a line drawn in the middle of everything I had been avoiding. I grabbed a pen from the drawer and flipped the paper over. On the back, I wrote 2 columns. One side was what I had been doing, the other was what I needed to change. The first column was easy rent payments, long shifts, waiting, hoping. The second column took longer. I sat there for almost an hour before I wrote the first word, ownership. It looked strange on the page, like it did not belong to me, but I did not cross it out. I added more underneath: credit, savings, assets, words I had heard before, but never really acted on. I opened my phone again, this time not to check my balance, but to search how to improve credit score, how to buy a home with low income, how to qualify for a loan. The answers were not simple, they were not fast, but they were there, step by step. Things I could learn, things I could do. I wrote down numbers, percentages, timelines. It was not exciting, it was not dramatic, but it was real. The clock on the wall moved past midnight, then 1 in the morning. I was still sitting there, still writing, still thinking about how different things could be if I stopped repeating the same pattern. I folded the paper again, not the notice this time, but the one I had just written, and placed it in my wallet. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the space around me, the worn cabinets, the small refrigerator, the floor that creaked near the sink. It had been enough for a long time, but now it felt temporary. For the first time, I did not feel like I was being pushed out. I felt like I was finally moving forward. I woke up before the alarm the next morning, not because I was rested, but because something had shifted inside me, the kind of shift that does not make noise, but changes everything. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. The apartment felt the same walls, same worn carpet, same faint smell of coffee from the machine I forgot to clean the night before, but I was not the same. I got dressed slowly, jeans, work boots, the same uniform I had worn for years. Nothing about it looked different, but it felt different, like I was putting on a version of myself that was about to change. I checked my wallet before leaving. The folded paper was still there, the one with the words I wrote, ownership, credit, savings. It was not much, but it felt heavier than anything I had carried before. I dropped my daughter off at school that morning. She smiled the same way she always did. Quick hug, quick goodbye, like everything was normal. I watched her walk toward the building, backpack bouncing slightly with each step, and I realized something. She trusted me. She believed things would be okay without asking how, and that thought stayed with me all the way to work. The warehouse was loud as usual, forklifts moving pallets, workers calling out numbers, the steady rhythm of boxes being stacked and moved. I clocked in and started my shift, lifting, carrying, repeating the same motions I had done thousands of times before, but this time I paid attention not to the work, but to the people around me, guys who had been there 10 years, 15 years, some of them longer than me, doing the same thing every day, hoping for overtime, hoping for a raise that barely kept up with rent. I saw myself in them, and for the first time I saw the future clearly. If I did nothing, this was it. This was the path I would stay on. I finished my shift, and instead of heading straight home, I sat in my car in the parking lot. Engine off, phone in my hand, I opened the notes from the night before and started taking action. Small steps, nothing dramatic. I pulled up my credit report again and looked at the details, missed payments, high utilization, things I could fix over time. I set reminders, pay down balances, call creditors, dispute errors. It was not exciting, but it was something I could control. I drove to my second job after that, picking up rides one after another. The city moved around me, lights, traffic, people heading somewhere. I listened more than I talked that night, listening to conversations about work, about money, about stress, about plans. Some people had goals, some people just had bills, and I realized I had been living in between, not fully stuck, but not moving forward either. Around midnight, I parked near a gas station and bought a small notebook, nothing expensive, just something I could carry with me. I sat in the car under the dim light and started writing again, numbers, ideas, timelines, how much I could save each week, what I needed to improve, how long it might take. It was not perfect, it was not even clear, but it was real, and it was mine. When I finally got home, the apartment was quiet. I walked through the door and looked around again, not with frustration, but with awareness. Every corner, every mark, every sound. I knew I would not be here much longer, and for the first time that did not feel like loss, it felt like direction. I placed the notebook next to my wallet on the table, turned off the light, and stood there in the dark for a moment, breathing steady, thinking about the days ahead, not as something to survive, but something to use. I still had time, not just the 30 days, but something more, something I had not given myself before, a reason to change. The next few days did not feel dramatic, they felt quiet, controlled, almost ordinary, but underneath everything was changing. I started waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted more time before the day took over. I sat at the kitchen table every morning with a cup of cheap coffee and my notebook open. The pages were filling up slowly, numbers, lists, small goals, things I could measure, things I could improve. I called the first creditor on a Tuesday morning. During my break at work, I stepped outside the warehouse. The air was cold, but clear. I explained my situation calmly, no excuses, no long story, just facts. They put me on hold for a few minutes, and when they came back, they offered a payment plan, lower interest. It was not a big win, but it was something real, something I had not done before. I wrote it down in the notebook, one line, small progress. I started tracking everything after that, every dollar, every expense. Every extra shift I picked up, I stopped buying things I did not need, not because I was forced to, but because I finally understood what those small choices added up to. I packed lunches instead of grabbing food on the way. I filled the gas tank once and planned my driving routes better. I turned small habits into deliberate actions, not perfect, not impressive, but consistent. At night when I drove, I listened differently. I stopped letting the radio fill the silence and started using that time to learn podcasts about money, about credit, about real estate, things I used to think were not for people like me. I did not understand everything at first, but I kept listening the same way. I kept working steady, focused, not looking for shortcuts, just looking for a path. One night, I picked up a passenger who worked in property management. He talked about buildings, tenants, repairs. Numbers that used to sound distant now sounded familiar. I asked a few simple questions, not trying to impress, just trying to understand. He explained things in plain terms: how properties made money, how expenses worked, how some owners struggled when things were not managed right. I dropped him off and sat there for a moment after he left, engine running, street quiet, and I realized something. The system was not hidden, it was just something I had never taken the time to learn before. The next day I checked my credit score again. It had not changed yet. I did not expect it to, but this time it did not feel like a fixed number. It felt like something that could move, something I could influence. I kept going day after day, small actions stacking on top of each other. I paid down one balance, then another, not quickly, but steadily. I called again when I needed to, adjusted when things did not work the way I planned. I stopped thinking about where I was going to move next and started thinking about where I wanted to end up. The apartment around me began to feel different, not worse, not better, just temporary, like a place I was passing through instead of something I was stuck in. I noticed things I had ignored before: the way the cabinets did not close right, the way the hallway light flickered every few minutes, the way the walls carried sound from the neighbors. Nothing had changed, but my attention had. I was no longer attached to it the way I used to be. I was already stepping away in my mind even before the 30 days were over. One evening I sat at the table again, looking at my notebook. The pages were no longer empty. They told a story, small steps repeated over time, small decisions that were starting to build something I could not see yet, but could feel forming. I closed the notebook and placed my hand on top of it for a moment. Steady, calm, no rush, no panic, just movement forward. And for the first time in years, I did not feel like I was reacting to life. I felt like I was shaping it piece by piece. I stopped thinking in weeks and started thinking in numbers: how much I owed, how much I could reduce, how long it would take if I stayed consistent. The notebook was no longer just an idea, it became a routine. Every night after work I sat at the same spot, same chair, same dim light, and reviewed everything I had done that day. I crossed out small debts one by one, not fast, not impressive, but real. Each line I crossed out felt like space, opening up space I had never given myself before. I began calling more places, asking questions I used to avoid. What does it take to qualify? What credit score do I need? What income level? What programs exist for someone like me? Some people rushed me off the phone, others gave short answers, but a few took their time. They explained things in simple terms: first-time buyer programs, low down payment options, things I had never seriously considered before, not because they were impossible, but because I had decided they were not for me a long time ago. I wrote everything down. Nothing was too small to note: percentages, timelines, requirements. It started to form a picture, not clear yet, but no longer impossible. One afternoon during a short break I checked my credit again. It moved only a few points, but I noticed it immediately: 602. It was still low, still far from where it needed to be, but it was no longer stuck. I stared at the number for a few seconds longer than usual, not celebrating, just acknowledging progress. I put the phone away and went back inside the warehouse. The noise, the movement, the same routine, but now I carried something different with me, a direction. I began picking up extra shifts whenever they were available. Not because I needed to survive, but because I was building something I controlled. How I used that money, I divided it carefully, some for debt, some for savings, some for nothing else. I opened a separate account, small at first, just a few $100s, then a little more each week. Watching it grow slowly was different than anything I had experienced before. It was not a paycheck that disappeared, it stayed, it accumulated, it represented time, effort, discipline, turning into something solid. One evening I drove past a small duplex for sale. The sign was simple, the building was not impressive: paint slightly worn, yard uneven, but it stood there quiet, steady. 2 units, one structure. I slowed down without realizing it and parked across the street, just looking at it. I did not get out, I did not call the number, I just sat there, engine running, thinking about what it meant to own something like that. Not a dream, not something distant, just a possibility that existed in the same city I lived, in the same Streets I drove every day. I eventually pulled away, but the image stayed with me that night. I wrote it down in the notebook: duplex, potential income, both units. I did not know how or when, but I knew it was something I needed to understand. I started reading more, looking at listings, learning terms, cap rate, mortgage, insurance, closing costs. It was a different language at first, but it started to make sense the more I stayed with it. I did not talk about it with anyone. I did not need validation. I did not need someone to agree. I just kept going quietly, consistently. The apartment around me felt smaller now, not physically, but mentally, like it no longer defined what I could do. I packed a few boxes early, things I did not use often, not because I was leaving, but because I was preparing, not just to move, but to move forward in a different way. The days kept passing, each one taking me closer to the deadline, but also closer to something else, something I had not allowed myself to believe in before. Not luck, not chance, just change, built slowly, one decision at a time. I started running the numbers more seriously after that night, not just writing them down, but testing them against reality. How much I earned each week, how much I could actually save after everything was paid. I broke it down carefully: rent, utilities, gas, food, small things that used to slip through unnoticed now had a place on the page. Nothing was ignored. Nothing was assumed. I needed clarity more than comfort. I called a loan officer one afternoon during my break. I kept it simple, explained my income, my credit, my situation. There was a pause on the line, then a calm voice walked me through what was possible. Not promises, not guarantees, just options. If I could reach a certain score, if I could show stable income, if I could keep saving, there were programs that could work for me. I wrote everything down again: minimum requirements, estimated down payment, closing costs, ranges, not exact numbers, but close enough to understand what I was working toward. When the call ended, I sat there for a moment, phone still in my hand, the warehouse noise behind me distant, like it was happening somewhere else. I was not discouraged. I was not overwhelmed. I was focused. The gap between where I was and where I needed to be was clear, and that was enough. I started adjusting my plan, tightening things where I could, cutting expenses that were not necessary, not dramatically, just consistently. I sold a few things I did not use: old tools, an extra television, some furniture that had been sitting in storage. It did not bring in much, but it added up, and more importantly, it simplified things around me. I kept my schedule tight: work, rest, repeat, nothing wasted, nothing random. The notebook became part of everything. I checked it before leaving the house, before starting my second job, before going to bed. It kept me accountable. It kept me honest. One evening, I drove back to the same duplex I had seen before. This time, I parked closer and stepped out. The air was quiet, the street calm. I walked along the sidewalk, slowly looking at the structure: 2 doors, 2 mailboxes, simple design, nothing special, but it stood there steady. I tried to imagine what it would feel like to own something like that, not just live in it, but control it, maintain it, build something from it. I stood there for a few minutes, longer than I planned, then walked back to my car without saying anything to anyone. It was not the right time yet, but it was no longer a distant idea. It was a target I could see. I drove home that night with a different kind of energy, not excitement, not pressure, just direction. The kind that does not rush you, but keeps you moving forward. When I got back, the apartment felt even more temporary. Boxes were stacked neatly, now labeled, organized, ready. I was not scrambling to leave. I was preparing to step into something else. I checked my credit again later that night. It had moved a little more, 624, still not where it needed to be, but moving in the right direction. I closed the app and leaned back in the chair, thinking about how small changes were starting to shift. Bigger things. Nothing about my life looked dramatically different from the outside. Same jobs, same car, same apartment, but inside everything was aligning. Decisions, actions, focus, all pointing toward something new. I folded the updated plan and placed it back in my wallet next to the original paper, the one that started all of this. They were both there now, one representing where I was, the other where I was going, and for the first time the distance between them did not feel impossible. It felt measurable. It felt real. The days started to move faster after that, not because time changed, but because I was using it differently. Every hour had a purpose. Every decision had a reason. I stopped waiting for things to happen and started measuring everything against the plan I had written down. I called the loan officer again, this time with updated numbers. My credit had improved. My balances were lower. My savings had grown slowly but consistently. There was another pause on the line, but this time it felt different, not uncertain, just calculated. He walked me through a possible range, not approval, not yet, but close enough to see the outline of something real. I wrote it down carefully, every figure, every condition I needed to meet. It was no longer a question of if, it was a matter of when and how well I could stay disciplined. I started visiting more properties, not with an agent, not officially, just driving by, slowing down, looking at Structures, understanding layouts, learning how to see value in things that did not look perfect. I noticed details I would have ignored before: roof condition, window frames, the way units were divided, parking space, small things that added up to bigger decisions. I was not guessing anymore. I was observing. One weekend, I took my daughter with me. We drove through a few neighborhoods, nothing special, just quiet streets, small buildings. She asked why we were looking at houses. I kept it simple. I told her we were planning for something better. She nodded like it made sense and went back to looking out the window. I realized she did not need all the details. She just needed to see that things were moving forward. I kept saving. Every week the account grew slowly, then a little faster, small deposits turning into something that felt stable. I checked my credit again. 658. Still not perfect, but strong enough to move into a different category. I did not celebrate. I just noted it in the notebook and moved to the next step. I contacted a real estate agent for the first time. The conversation was direct. I explained where I stood, what I was looking for, what I could realistically handle. There was no hesitation, no sales talk, just information. He sent me a few listings, nothing flashy, mostly small duplexes, modest properties that fit within the numbers I had been working with. I reviewed each one carefully, comparing prices, estimating payments, calculating potential income from one unit. It was not overwhelming. It was structured. It made sense. One property stood out, not perfect, not new, but solid. 2 units, separate entrances, decent condition. I drove there again, this time with a different mindset, not just looking, but evaluating. I walked around the block, slowly noticing the surroundings, the noise level, the condition of nearby buildings. It felt stable, nothing impressive, but nothing broken either. I sat in my car afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, thinking through everything. The numbers lined up. The situation made sense. It was not a dream, it was a decision. I called the agent from the car, my voice steady. I asked for the next step, what it would take to move forward. He explained the process simply: pre-approval, paperwork, inspection, timeline. I wrote it all down like I always did. No rush, no excitement, just clarity. When I got home that night, the apartment felt like a place I had already left behind. Even though my things were still there, even though the boxes were only half packed, I stood in the middle of the room looking around once more, not with attachment, not with frustration, just awareness. This had been my starting point, not my ending. I picked up the notice again, the one that started everything, and held it for a second longer than usual. Then I folded it neatly and placed it back in my wallet next to the updated plan, both of them side by side, the past and the direction I was moving toward. And for the first time, they felt connected, not separate, not conflicting, just part of the same path leading somewhere I had never been before. I moved forward with the process step by step, nothing rushed, nothing assumed. The pre-approval came through a few days later, not perfect, not unlimited, but enough. It gave me a range, something real to work within. I read through the numbers carefully: interest rate, monthly payment, estimated closing costs. I did not focus on what I wished it could be. I focused on what it was and whether it made sense. The duplex I had been watching stayed within that range. It was not the cheapest option, but it was stable, and that mattered more to me than anything else. I met the agent there one afternoon after work. The sun was low, the light soft against the building. It looked the same as before: 2 doors, 2 windows each side, nothing impressive, nothing polished, but solid. We walked through the first unit slowly. I paid attention to everything: floors, walls, appliances, small details that would matter later. Nothing was perfect, but nothing was broken beyond repair. The second unit was occupied, quiet, clean, someone living their life the same way I had been for years, paying rent, maintaining a routine, not thinking beyond the next month. I stood there for a moment longer than expected, not judging, not comparing, just understanding what this place represented: both sides of the same situation, one as a tenant, one as an owner. I stepped outside again and looked at the structure from the sidewalk. The agent spoke about potential rental income, maintenance costs, small improvements that could increase value. I listened carefully, not rushing to respond, not letting excitement take over. I asked simple questions: what were the average expenses? What kind of repairs had been done? How stable were the tenants? Everything had an answer, not perfect, but clear enough to build a decision on. I drove home afterward in silence, no music, no distractions, just thinking through everything one more time. The numbers lined up, the situation made sense. It was not a gamble, it was a step forward. I sat at the kitchen table again that night, notebook open, pen in hand. I rewrote everything: purchase price, monthly payment, estimated income, repair budget, savings remaining after closing. I went through it slowly, making sure there were no gaps, no assumptions that could break later. When I finished, I looked at the page for a long time, not imagining, not hoping, just verifying it was real. It could work. The next morning, I made the call. I told the agent I was ready to submit an offer. My voice was steady, no hesitation, no need to explain. The process started. Paperwork, signatures, timelines, inspections, everything moved faster than I expected, but I stayed calm. I followed each step exactly the way it was laid out, providing documents, answering questions, staying organized. The same discipline that brought me here carried me through it. The days that followed felt different, not stressful, not overwhelming, just focused. I continued working both jobs, saving what I could, not changing the routine that had built this foundation. The apartment around me was almost empty now, boxes stacked near the door, essentials packed away, ready to move. But this time it was not just about leaving, it was about stepping into something I had chosen, something I had built piece by piece. When the inspection came back, there were minor issues, nothing unexpected, nothing that changed the decision. I adjusted the numbers, slightly added a small buffer, and moved forward without hesitation. The final paperwork came soon after, signatures, dates, confirmations, everything aligned quietly, without drama, without noise. I sat at the table one last time in that apartment, the same place where I had started this plan, and looked at the space around me, not with relief, not with regret, just recognition. This was where I changed direction. This was where everything shifted from reaction to intention. I picked up the folded notice again, held it for a moment, then placed it back in my wallet, beside the approval documents, both still there, both part of the same path. But now the outcome was no longer uncertain, it was already in motion. I closed on the property on a quiet weekday morning, no celebration, no announcement, just a signature, a handshake, and a set of keys placed in my hand. The weight of them was simple metal, but it felt different than anything I had held before, not because of what they were, but because of what they represented. I sat in my car for a moment afterward, looking at them, resting in my palm, steady, quiet, real. I drove straight to the duplex, without stopping. The street looked the same as always, calm, familiar. Nothing about it suggested anything had changed, but everything had. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the door, slower than I expected, not from hesitation, but from awareness. Each step mattered in a way it never had before. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The unit that would now be mine to live in. The space was empty, walls, clean floor, simple, nothing luxurious, nothing designed to impress, but it was solid, it was mine. I walked through each room one at a time, kitchen, living area, bedroom, checking everything, not for flaws, but for understanding. This was no longer something I passed through, this was something I was responsible for. I set the keys down on the counter and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle. It was not a dramatic feeling, it was not overwhelming, it was steady, controlled, earned. I moved my daughter in that weekend. We carried boxes one at a time up the short walkway, nothing rushed, nothing chaotic. She looked around the space, curious, then smiled, a little bigger than usual, like she understood more than she said. I set up her room first, bed, desk, small shelf, the same way it had been before, just in a different place, a better place. I spent the next few days making small adjustments, fixing minor things, tightening loose handles, replacing a light fixture, nothing complicated, just care, attention, the kind I never expected from the place I used to rent. I met the tenant in the other unit shortly after. Polite conversation, simple introduction. I kept it respectful, clear, nothing changed for them in a negative way. If anything, I made sure things were handled better than before. Repairs would be addressed, communication would be direct, no uncertainty, no neglect. I handled the first rent payment differently this time, not as something I owed, but as something I managed. I tracked it, recorded it, understood where it fit into the larger picture, expenses, income, maintenance, everything connected. It was not just about owning a building, it was about understanding it, running it properly, keeping it stable. I kept working both jobs for a while longer, not out of necessity, but out of discipline. I did not rush to change everything. I stayed consistent, continued saving, continued learning, building a stronger foundation. Each week, I drove past my old apartment once on the way back from a shift, not planned, just part of the route. The building looked the same as it always had, lights on, windows filled with lives moving in and out. Nothing had changed there, and that was the point. I slowed down for a second, then kept driving. No need to stop, no need to look back any longer. When I got home, I placed the keys on the same counter where I had first set them down and pulled out my wallet. The folded notice was still there, worn at the edges. Now I held it for a moment, then unfolded it, reading the words again slowly, not with frustration, not with anger, just clarity. I folded it back up and placed it next to the new documents, ownership papers, statements, records, everything that followed from that one moment, both sides of the same path, one where I had been and one where I was now standing. I turned off the light and stood there in the Quiet space, not thinking about what had happened, but recognizing what had changed, not overnight, not by chance, but step by step, decision by decision, until the direction was no longer uncertain, it was lived.